Hello, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library. Really happy to see you here today for this really important conversation. But before we get to it with Professor Rachel Cobb, I just want to tell you a few things. We do have captioning available both with Otter and with Zoom, and I will put instructions on how to use them in the chat once I hand this over to Rachel. Um, we cannot do our adult programming without our library foundation, so we always like to thank them, and we are so appreciative of the donors who donate to the foundation that help us make this happen. So thank you. We are recording this, so we will put it on our YouTube channel afterwards for anybody who misses it or wants to revisit it, because I always enjoy watching things a second time to see what I missed. We will have a time for Q&A. You can put questions in the chat. I will be paying attention to that. And we will take those questions after Rachel's presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to not hand it over to Rachel yet. I want to tell you who she is. Rachel Cobb was here with us last July for another program on voting rights. She is the chair and associate professor of government and at Suffolk University. She specializes in U.S. elections, election administration, and political participation. So I find that she's just the perfect person for this talk. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here with you and with everyone. Hello to all of my friends and colleagues out there. I am about to share my screen, so I just want to get that to be working. There we go. So, Mina, I can't remember when we organized this talk, but I think it was before or maybe it was right after the election. I mean, there was a lot we didn't know. And so coming up with the title for the talk was a bit of a trick. So little did I know. I definitely know that the title came before January 6th. And so little did we know that day would bring, I think, so much more meaning to this title of democratic legitimacy, and for sure turbulent times, which has certainly not diminished since the results of the election. So today I'm really going to discuss sort of where we are as a country, and what some of the possible reasons for that is, where public opinion is, kind of the state of political parties, some reform proposals that have been put forward, and then sort of discuss the viability of any and all of those. My plan is to talk for about 20 minutes. I'm going to try to keep to that. And I really, really welcome just the conversation and the questions that we'll have. So sort of, I think what I'm doing is like sprinkling some ideas out there, and then we'll get into the meat of it. So let's just begin. I always begin with definitions. What do we mean by democratic legitimacy? And Jorge Aragon argues that legitimacy is the people's recognition, and this is broad, right? The people's recognition and acceptance of the validity of the rules of their entire political system and the decisions of their rulers. So that's just the definition of legitimacy. I'm going to say it one more time. The people's recognition and acceptance of the validity of the rules of their entire political system and the decisions of their rulers. And democratic legitimacy adds to that this is based on popular consent, this notion that we have all agreed to these rules in some very important way so as to accept the validity. The challenge right now is that 30 to 40 million Republican voters, 72% of Republican voters, are convinced that the results of the election are fraudulent. and that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president of the United States. And 74% of them have said that allegations of voter fraud really contributed to their concerns. And we know that a huge number of Democrats, in fact, nearly, well over 90% of Democrats are convinced that the election results are legitimate. But 42% of independents do not trust the election results. So I think we are all aware of this, and this is the foundation of the central challenge that we go march into 2021 with, of what that means for governance, what it means for the future of our country, what it means for Congress's ability to behave in its role of legislating, what it means for the for President Biden in his ability to pass his agenda. So it's about legislating, it's about governance, and then it is also about, and I think as well, this is the sort of broader existential issue of what it means for democracy and what it means for the future of essentially whether there will be more violence. Okay, so let's go back, time machine, to Robert Dahl, a democratic theorist who wrote a great book, How Democratic is the American Constitution, and in fact wrote about many of the central issues of the Constitution, but said in his work Polyarchy, I assume that a key characteristic of democracy is the continued responsiveness of the government to the preferences of its citizens considered as political equals. So one of the things I think I want to talk about tonight is how responsive has the government been so to the preferences of its citizens, and are people considered political equals, and what does that mean? Martin Gilens, a political scientist, wrote that responsiveness is strongly tilted toward the most affluent citizens. And indeed, under most circumstances, the preferences of the vast majority of Americans appear to have essentially no impact on which policies the government does or does not adopt. If I were to try to identify some of the reasons for our current political challenges, there are many, and we will talk about them, but the relationship between government and citizens, and whether their preferences are actually carried out in policies, is a key challenge. Moreover, the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, the growing inequality in the United States, is a major, I would argue, contributor to our current state. Not that any of this didn't exist prior to that, but it has certainly contributed to the anxiety and the challenges that are felt today. Larry Bartels is a political scientist, and his work looking at senators' responsiveness to income groups, looking at the 107th to the 110th Congress, just to give a kind of snapshot of what we mean by responsiveness and income and the relationship between that. The green line is high income people. The blue is low income, and the red is middle income. And this, I'm sorry, the y-axis is the responsiveness to the policy preferences. And the main takeaway from this graph, it is that the high income individuals have the highest level of policy responsiveness from the Senate, and this is true in the House as well, so that their interests are heard and acted upon, and the interests of those in the lower and middle income, the middle and lower income brackets are heard barely a peep. And it is not that the middle and low income people are not making their policy preferences known, although there are issues with organization and the level of organization that those in high income brackets have, comparatively speaking. But it is of who is getting elected, how they're getting elected, and the current political system. This is a graph showing the gap between the upper class and everyone else has been growing for decades, showing that between 1983 all the way over to 2016, the gap has simply widened and not diminished whatsoever. So we go from a 28% gap in 1983 to a 62% gap in 2016. That for sure has dramatic consequences on the political system and whether the political system can kind of weather that level of inequality. Moreover, now the question is cause and effect. Americans largely don't trust their political institutions. And so this is graphs showing the share of responses of how much trust and confidence respondents had for the executive branch over here and the legislative branch over here. And this tracks it from 1987 to 2020, and again from 1987 to 2020. And you can see a general decline in the executive branch and an even steeper decline for the legislative branch. So the belief that government can be helpful, the belief that government can be trusted, the belief in all of that. And political scientists were worried about trust in government well before 1997. And the situation has just gotten worse. Political scientists were concerned about political inequality, major stories coming out when I was in grad school about this in 2001, and it has just gotten worse. So these are trends that have been trending for a considerable amount of time, and one would expect essentially that at some point they would either get better or there would be some major crisis in the political system, which I do think is something we are experiencing right now. And just to go back to the election of 2020, these are the graphs that Charles Stewart at MIT has made showing, so I'm going to walk you through this because there's a lot of data here. Lines and then probably tiny lines, which I'm not sure you can see on your screens. But the main takeaway here, first of all, the red is Republicans, the blue is Democrats. So in states that Trump lost, Republicans were less confident that the votes in their state were counted as they intended when more ballots were cast by mail. So the pallor that President Trump at the time put over the method of voting had a dramatic impact on the level of confidence that people had in the votes cast. So by saying that all mail was fraudulent and that this was just going to encourage terrible things, I'm just going to turn off my, there we go, sorry. So that you don't have to get all of my alerts. He was quite effective in his rhetoric. This pattern, however, did not hold in states that Trump won. And whether Democrats had confidence that their state votes were counted as intended was unrelated to the fraction of ballots cast by mail. So Democrats were not impacted by that messaging, but Republicans were highly impacted by that messaging. So a lot of people, a lot of alarm bells about the state of democracy and where we're going with democracy. There's a book, How Democracies Die, that came out at the beginning of the Trump administration. There are various concerns about democratic consolidation, and a whole group of academics had started to teach this class and have a curriculum on democratic erosion, where they're comparing democracies around the world with students at college campuses around the country. And this class has been going on for at least 2 years, if not even more. And there is just considerable attention to what erosion in democratic systems mean. So now I'm going to present some evidence of how this is essentially impacting one political party even more than the other. And that is the case of the Republican Party in the United States. So Republicans' anti-democratic attitudes in a YouGov survey in January 2020. So this was a full year ago. And questions were asked whether you agree with these statements. So the first statement is, the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. 24% of Republicans strongly agreed, 26.7% agreed, and 27% were unsure with a size, I don't want to say a big minority, small group of people disagreeing or strongly disagreeing. So the overwhelming support was either in the unsure category all the way over to the strongly agree or agree. The next statement was, a time will come when patriotic Americans have to take the law into their own hands. Again, a year ago, and we have 15%, 26.3% strongly or agreeing. Next statement, strong leaders sometimes have to bend the rules in order to get things done. 12.5% strongly agreeing, 34.8% agreeing. And then finally, it's hard to trust the results of elections when so many people will vote for anyone who offers a handout. And we have 34.1% strongly agreeing, with 39.8% agreeing. So the takeaway from this is that there is a extremely strong undercurrent of belief in anti-democratic attitudes that is quite prevalent in people who identify as Republicans. But it is not unique only to Republicans, although those statements are much stronger with Republicans. So I can try to parse that out if that's confusing, but I'll say a little bit more. This is overall, this is not just with Republicans, but with all a survey looking at the United States population. Surveys conducted between 2010 and 2017, so even before Donald Trump came to power. They were employing items originally designed for use in Latin America, found that 23 to 36% of US respondents agreed that a military coup would be justified when there was a lot of crime or when there is a lot of corruption. And then in 2017 to 2018, 73% of Americans said it was important or essential that government does not interfere with journalists or news organizations. And when I was preparing this, the key word that I left out here, because it was, it's leading, but it said only 73% of Americans said it was important or essential. And so here we can say only 68% said it was important or essential that government effectively prevent private actors from engaging in politically motivated violence or intimidation. And some more survey evidence. In 2017, with a Republican in the White House, Republicans were twice as likely as Democrats to agree that when the country is facing very difficult times, it is justifiable for the president of the country to close the Congress and govern without Congress. But in 2014, with a Democratic president and a Republican majority in Congress, that partisan difference was reversed, with 30% of Democrats, but only 6% of Republicans willing to have the president close Congress. So, the key thing here is that context matters, who's in power matters, and your ability to trust that the government is doing what you believe it should be doing or is doing in your interest, or having a sense that there is that it is not corrupt, has a lot to do with the party in power. Calmo and Mason found that majorities of Democrats and Republicans alike viewed the other party as a serious threat to the United States and its people. And Democrats were slightly more likely to say that violence would be justified if the opposing party won the 2020 presidential election. So all of this is to say that we are in a deep crisis, because I think the key question here is if we can't even agree on the rules, and if we can't agree that the people in power are going to serve us, then we are in a crisis. Julie Wronski, a political scientist at the University of Mississippi, said to the New York Times a few weeks ago, when groups within American society believe in two different sets of rules on how to play the game of democracy, it cannot be played, and we become ungovernable. And the conclusion here is that this specific political context essentially shapes the degree to which we are willing to believe in or discuss, to believe in democracy, essentially. Going back a little bit to Republican attitudes and anti-democratic attitudes based on education, based on political interest, and based on locale. And this is the average agreement of questions around whether you believe that it is hard to trust elections, or whether it is okay to use force to save your way of life, or whether you think it is okay for strong leaders to bend the rules, or whether you think it is okay for citizens to take the law into their own hands. You can see that the more education you have, the lower it is. Your level of political interest, the higher it is. And where you are, whether you're in a rural area, a small town, a suburban area, a smaller city, or a big city, that has some impact as well. And so if you're in a big city, there's a sort of a little bit less than if you're in a rural area, but it's small. One of the key things, and this shows up again and again in the work of political scientists driving some of these attitudes, is an ethnic antagonism that Trump was extremely successful rhetorically on drawing on, and that fear of other has had a substantially negative effect on the Republicans' commitment to democracy. And a major concern is that their way of life is disappearing, with most Republicans in a January 2020 survey agreeing that the traditional American way of life is disappearing, so that fast we may have to use force to save it. And they agreed that a time will come when patriotic Americans have to take the law into their own hands. So this is foreshadowing the events of January 6, 2021. So I am now looking at the time and seeing that I have a few more slides and wanted to wrap at this point. So I'm going to go a little bit faster. One of the things that political scientists have also pointed out is that if we had a well-functioning multi-party system, as many European democracies do, their argument is that those anti-democratic forces would essentially be isolated to a minor party. They would be part of the system, but they would not be but because we have a two-party system, they have essentially been able to finagle a hostile takeover of the Republican Party here in the United States, whereas if we had a multi-party system, it would be less likely. There are debates about whether it is entirely true that, so one argument is, well, yeah, but if we had a multi-party system, we would enable the presence of them in the first place, versus a two-party system where perhaps it could be fully extricated. That's one of the arguments. One of the other arguments is that originally in 2016, the argument that Trump had essentially been a rhetorical entrepreneur who had finagled a hostile takeover of the Republican Party has since become, many of his fiercest critics in 2016 have become his sincerest friends by 2021. And so it has become a party that has adapted to become the Trump party rather than the other way around. And his impact has gone vertically as well. It's not just across at the federal level, but he's been able to orchestrate a sort of takeover of Republican parties at the state level and emboldened fringe organizations and individuals in ethno-nationalist on the right. I will zip through some of these most recent surveys, looking at who are the people who are members of the Trumpites and what they believe in, the kind of group membership of who belongs. The main thing is very strong gun rights, pro-police, anti-lockdown, pro-life. The key characteristics of his support is that it is drawn from white Christian males who are older, have more income, and then the views of these folks about women, and we'll look at their views on Blacks and immigrants in a moment. That if you look at the yellow being disagree and the red being agree with comments like, should women interpret innocent remarks as sexist? If you are a Make America Great supporter, you agree. Women are seeking special favors, agree. Feminists make unreasonable demands on men, strong agreement. And feminists are seeking more power than men, strong agreement. Views on immigration. Immigration is changing the culture for the worse. We're in the 75% zone. Immigrants refuse to abide by laws in the 75% zone, and the economy is strengthened by the hard work of Latino immigrants, a little bit lower, 55%. And then views on race. Slavery or discrimination made working up difficult for Blacks. Very wide disagreement. Blacks have gotten less than they deserve. Disagreement. Blacks would be well off as whites if they tried. Most Blacks on welfare could get a job if they tried, and Blacks should work their way up like other minorities. A huge percentage there. I'm going to skip that. And I've essentially covered that. So some of the speculation about why this is the case in the United States, as opposed to, why this is the case in the United States, let's leave it at that. One argument is, well, it's money in politics. And if we didn't have money in politics, the way we do right now, and especially the impact of Citizens United, everything would be better. The argument being that that has kind of spurred low and unequal voter turnout. Even pre-Citizens United, that was the case. Another argument is that we have a very weak labor system in the United States, very low participation in labor unions at about 6% versus its peak in the 1950s of 55%. And so that has meant that that power that working class people had is no longer there politically. And so that has had a detrimental impact on the political system. Another argument is that, well, it's the Senate and the malapportioned Senate. And if you didn't know, the United States Senate is the most malapportioned legislature in the world. And the other argument is essentially in our political system, we're sort of geared towards the status quo. It's very hard to make massive change, and there's so many points of entry to shut down a bill or to get things done that that the status quo bias means that action isn't taken, and so people lose trust. Another argument is that it's the political culture of the United States. We have an overall antipathy to big government, and the rhetoric of anti-government has been there from the beginning, and so that means that we're going to lose trust in it. And then the final one being that there's that the overall level of inequality in the United States has magnified the political clout of the rich and meant that we are essentially in a situation of a rule by an elite, affluent few with very low opportunities for participation among others. The challenge is that some of these same issues of ethno-nationalism and political hatred essentially exist everywhere. And these things that we've pointed out here are features of the American political system, but they are not features of every democracy in the world. And yet many of the challenges that we face are challenges faced by democracies around the world. So to suggest that these are causal means a lot more unpacking and perhaps not true, given the challenges of other democracies. I'm going to leave that last one out because it's complicated. So the solutions that are on the table for democratic reform, I mean, this is certainly not an exhaustive list. I'm just putting up some of the top few. One argument is that if we had multi-member congressional districts, that would mean that, so take the case of Massachusetts, what would that look like? Right now, Massachusetts has 9 congressional districts. Suppose we had 3 congressional districts with 3 members from each district. In that way, the Republicans who don't form a majority in any of the 9 congressional districts may have a shot at getting a member from one of the, if there were 3, because they would have a greater number and the ability to elect someone from that. So the argument there is that it would enable a broader population that politicians had to appeal to, and would produce a different outcome in terms of who would be going to Congress, and that would in some way translate then to responsiveness. Another argument is that as proportional representation to replace single district winner take all system, or that could be essentially a ranked choice version. The argument being that at the moment, because we have this winner take all in a case like someone help me out here, the congressional district with Brookline, Jake Oshloss just came, I'm just blanking on the number there. But in that congressional district, he only got 24% of the vote. And so if we could have a ranked choice system or proportional representation system, it would mean that the person who actually truly represented the preferences of the majority of people would be able to get elected. Another argument is campaign finance. If we were able to change that and essentially have money not have as much of a role in who is able to exert political influence, who is able to fund political campaigns, who is able to speak and have that be heard, that would alter the tenor of the discussion. It would alter who feels that they can run for elected office. But again, we're seeing here, there's a very supply heavy set of arguments in terms of who our political leaders are and who we would get to Congress.
Mommy?
I have a
Mommy?
visitor.
Mommy?
Mommy? So excuse me for just
Mommy?
one moment. Yes.
Mommy?
Yes.
Can I have this pencil?
No. She's
No.
asking for a Sharpie. I'm
I
gonna say no. Yes, that one you can have. Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
can I have one more thing?
Yes.
The pencil?
Yes. Another argument is to end the filibuster,
Actually, I need
which I think I misspelled, so I apologize. And that argument is that essentially we have a system where a supermajority is needed to pass legislation, and it's a relic of a pro-slavery core in the United States Senate, and not necessary anymore. I know some fervent defenders of the filibuster, so it's there's a good argument to be had there, but there's this argument that somehow changing the rules internally, institutionally, could have a massive impact. And then finally, greater protection for voting rights. And that is a demand side view of what the solutions are. The argument there being that if we had broader participation, that would have an impact on the overall political climate. I think you can hear from what how I've treated these. I think there's good reasons for all of them, whether that shifts political discourse, whether that shifts the views of people who are now believing that political violence is the solution. I don't think that these get at that entirely. That's a deeper issue and a hearts and minds issue that institutional changes alone, if they could even be enacted, which I think is challenging, would not get at. But I am open to hearing the opinions of others on that front, and I will end there and take questions.
Rachel. Thank you. I think you did miss the independent commissions draw districts. I assume that's about
gerrymandering. Yes, I did. Yes, that is exactly right. Thank you. I got that little interruption on the Sharpies. So I apologize for that. Right. So the argument is that gerrymandering is a threat because it is essentially the foxes who are guarding the hen house, and it is politicians who get to draw the districts. It is politicians who get to set the rules of the game for our electoral system. I mean, in fact, independent commissions, I think, actually doesn't go far enough in taking some of the design of the political system out of the hands of the people who are holding the political power right now. But that argument is indeed an anti-gerrymandering argument.
I thought so. So Judy has a question about campaign finance reform. Isn't the increasing influence of the internet diluting the importance of money in politics, national politics at least?
So let me think about that. Isn't the increasing influence of the internet diluting? All right, that's a great idea. And the answer is, I am not looking at the data on this, so I don't know the empirical answer to this, but I'll give you my speculative answer on what I think. the tricky thing is here that people with money can purchase the messaging on the internet just as much as they can purchase ads, just as much as they can get their signs out there. So money does buy political speech, and it buys algorithms, and it buys the ability for affluent voices to have a greater a sort of hold on what the messaging is on the internet. So unless you are free of being sucked into algorithms that are going to get you to the places that people, quote unquote, running the internet want you to get to, money is still playing a significant role there. And then the other thing is just the corrosive role that money plays in other ways. It plays it because in its way that it is discouraging people from running for office in the first place, because it's just such a high cost to run for office. Generally, you just, you need to raise a lot of money. So you need to have friends who have money to give you the money to run for office. And then B, the other piece of that is, and this is where I think campaign finance, that's one reform, but the other reform is just the role that money plays once in office, of who legislators hear from and how they hear it. So if you are well funded and have a whole army of lobbyists behind you, you can write legislation that you can copy in state after state after state after state. And you can get your message out there. You can get in front of legislators. There's all of this stuff that you can buy, even if it's not just FaceTime, it's also just giving them the information that they want. And so that is also a major concern in terms of the role that they play in lobbying, writing legislation, the role that money plays in being able to purchase information, which is what politicians, they're short. What are they short on? They're short on time. And so if you can cut their information costs, you are able to get them, you are able to get in front of them in a way that less organized, less affluent people are able to.
Mm-hmm. So Edward says, we know the story of demagoguery taking over in Germany in the 1930s for the next 20 years. Are there good examples illustrating a society rebounding from demagoguery in a brief period, like Biden being elected after 4 years? I'm not just asking about the election, but social culture, like in Germany and in the US.
Well, Edward, that is the question I am asking too. This is what I want to know. So if anybody knows the answer to that, please let me know, because that's what I think we need to be studying right now, if that exists. But there is try to remember his name. So a good book written, excuse me.
Mommy, can I make golden paper?
Yes.
By myself?
Yeah. She's mixing things. Don't let her do that. And take.
I can't mix it.
Okay.
Mommy, can I please mix things?
Go talk to Dahl about it. Okay. Okay. Sorry. I'm gonna pause for a moment and be right there.
Do you guys have opinions on this topic about Biden only having 4 years to fix a system that's been broken for about 20? Oh, Rachel, you're muted.
Okay, thank you. I thought you brilliantly muted me, for which I'm very grateful. Okay, so a book that I read in grad school, which, so title and author vaguely in my mind, but I don't want to make a mistake. the central argument of this book was the role that essentially the United States made in Germany, especially following World War II, in kind of orchestrating a healing process, not entirely, but orchestrating a set of policies that would help the Germans to feel safe and secure, so that they would not want to engage in war again. The argument being that essentially providing a social safety net went a long way toward promoting democratic ideals. And when you look at the state of the country right now, especially with so many people unemployed, suffering economically, suffering from climate change, suffering from worries of, massive economic anxiety, massive anxiety over healthcare, massive anxiety over housing, ameliorating some of that anxiety through a social welfare set of policies, it doesn't fix it, but it does alter the position in which people are coming from, and the sense of essentially economic alienation that many are feeling right now. But we also know, I can hear the arguments to me saying, yeah, but that doesn't solve the ethno-nationalism, and that doesn't solve the issues of racial inequality, and the fears of change that are driving a lot of this. That it is really demographic shifts and a shift in the color of the United States. So that is true. That is the other piece here that needs to be dealt with. And that, so my question to everyone is, does this mean truth and reconciliation commissions? Does this mean a sort of really deep probing of our views on race and ethnicity and immigration? But here it is, the United States needs to be the innovator, because I don't think any other country has country in the state that we are in right now come to terms with its history in the same way that I think we need to in order to address those challenges.
But wasn't there also accountability after World War II in terms of like the Nuremberg trials and things like that, which doesn't seem to be happening as much now?
Right. And there was a sort of worldwide consensus that needed to happen. And there's not the political will for that right now, but you're absolutely right. But there was the tragedy was so great and the recognition of it so high. The challenge here is that we have, the historians can weigh in more than I can to be able to say what the state of the world was. And I know that there is a historian who can, my history teacher can answer this.
Oh, that's funny. Judy wrote, regarding post-World War II Germany, don't underestimate Adenauer's roles and influence. So I think we do need a historian here.
Yes, so somebody else needs to discuss that more than I, because I don't know.
Well, I do have a question about voting rights currently, that, because the Constitution really leaves voting rights with states, how can the federal government influence voting to make it more fair or equitable?
Well, the Congress can pass laws taking power away from the states, essentially, to say that there's, and which essentially not that it had done with the Voting Rights Act, to say, look, if you have a significant history of discrimination, we are going to need to review any major changes that you make to your voting laws and make sure that they are not going to have a discriminatory impact before you do anything. So, hey, states, check it out. We're going to review it. And so that had two impacts. One, it had the impact of essentially that they were not going to even suggest changes unless, because they knew that it would essentially be shot down by the federal government. And then the other thing was that the federal government actually had the power to shoot it down. The Supreme Court essentially took away that power from Congress in 2013, even though the Voting Rights Act had been reauthorized in 2006 by a Republican Congress, Republican president, massive support for the actions that the Voting Rights Act was taken, and then 9 justices on the Supreme Court determined, well, actually not 9, 5-4, determined that that was not that was no longer needed. So essentially, to re-establish the powers of the Voting Rights Act would be one major way. And Congress can say, it can be contested in court, but Congress can say there are certain key things that we value about voting and that need to be done in order to make this successful, and take that away from the states.
Judy made a follow-up comment about the point of the Adenauer question implicitly is that leadership individuals have influence as well as impose policies, which seems absolutely correct.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Judy, I'm going to have to, I want to get at what you are trying to say here, that individuals, right, so if I'm reading this correctly, that rhetoric and sort of helping people move forward is as necessary as policy shifts. And for sure, ideas play a central role in moving us forward. So we have to have, and we can have a shift in how we talk about things, a shift in how we lead, a shift in how we in rhetoric. That the thing that we're up against right now is these extremely segregated bubbles that we're living in, where one set of people are living in one set of rhetorical standards, and another set of people are living in an entirely different world of rhetorical standards. And the algorithms of social media are propelling us to the most polarized sides of those rhetorical standards. And we are not meeting at all with each other and knowing each other as human beings. And we are, I don't know the exact statistic, but people are more concerned about their offspring marrying somebody of another party than they are of them marrying somebody of another, I think, race or religion. That party is an incredibly powerful force right now of segregation.
Thank you. So we have time maybe for just one more question, if anybody has one. I was going to ask you about what, we know that Trump is more of a symbol or a symptom of the problem that's been happening for the last 20 years, and that 4 years is probably 2 to 4 years is not going to be enough to sort of take care of this situation. But is there something concrete that we can do as residents of Lexington to move this forward a little bit?
Well, we can all promote the investment in the future. And I mean, it sounds sort of cliche, but we can all promote investment. What do we need going forward? We need educated citizens. So we need to promote education. We need to promote, I think, civics and an understanding and a broad understanding. But as citizens ourselves, mentoring our young people, giving them hope, being available to them is truly critical to their development, especially right now when so many of them are feeling so lost and so empty. So now I'm going in, beyond the world of the political scientists, but to this kind of crisis of loneliness as well, and where people are finding community. They're finding community in some of these online forums, and they're finding community in the conspiracy theories. They're finding community in these kinds of answers that others were providing. So even those just one-on-one relationships with people, so that they're not feeling as lonely, and so that they're feeling that there is hope and there is the investment. Mm-hmm. So it's what we as citizens can do is make sure that and I'll say the other thing. When we talk about the rhetoric, I think calling all politicians to task for using violent rhetoric is really important. It is not, there is no party that has the monopoly on using bad language and on othering people, and on essentially making them into monsters. And it is really important that we not let that kind of toxic language take over everywhere. And so that's the other thing we can do is, when we disagree in a way that is civil, and then not permit people to use that out in the, call them on it and say, I don't approve.
Mm-hmm. I'm just asking one last question from an attendee. This is from Jerry, and she wants to know, how can journalists report in ways that shift the focus from political power struggles to elevating human issues, and how can we address them as a country? Would such a shift in journalistic emphasis help to lower polarization among the electorates? And I would like to add, is that genie just out of the bottle? Is it too late?
Yeah. So a couple of things on this. I think the genie is out of the bottle in the sense that we have even a polarized media, and there are, there's a right and the left in the media, and those who are trying to be in the center are vilified by the right, and not as much by the left, but certainly the left is the far left is saying, you're not going, you're too mainstream and you're corporate, or you're this or you're that. And then the right is saying, you're just the liberal media that's spouting lies. So, no matter where you go, people have negative things to say about journalists. And certainly we have all seen journalists behave in ways that are concerning. That being said, there is, and I was part of a group, I wasn't part of a group of journalists, but I was very lucky to be part of a kind of a listserv on how can we report on the election this year so that we are doing it in a way that is accessible to people, that is giving them factual information, that is highlighting the things that should be highlighted. Real soul searching among journalists about how to be good, and how to be on the side of doing their job in the best possible way, to focus on the important struggles, etc. And it was the network of journalists focusing on elections. I think I think journalists who are professionals really want to do their job well, and that kind of level of support that I observed in the 2020 election, that doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of people who are coordinating that, and who have funds to do that, and who have expertise that is being provided by outsiders to do that, who get the Neiman fellowships or whatever it is. I think one thing I would love to say about journalists is that they do want to do their job well. Letters to the editor can make a big difference, and just letters to them saying, hey, like, you missed it. They hear that. They really hear that, and they really take it to heart, and they really want to do a good job. But the other thing that I think all of us can do, whether we're in Lexington, Cambridge, or Massachusetts, or anywhere in the United States, is promote subscriptions to newspapers. I think we should make, I think that is a basic civic habit that our young people don't even know exists. So if they can all buy those subscriptions to whatever their local newspapers are, that will go a long way toward providing the necessary funds that journalists need in order to do their jobs. So that's a key necessary ingredient to democracy, is to having an excellent press. But the only way we have an excellent press is that people are actually buying it.
Oh. Thank you, Rachel. That was amazing. I really learned a lot. I know you have to get back to a Sharpie wielding 4-year-old, so I do want to just say thank you again for this wonderful talk, and I feel a little bit more hopeful, just a teensy bit.
Good.
So
well, I'm glad, because I thought I was going to be all doom and gloom, so that's good.
No, not at all. I think you gave us some really good advice on how we could possibly move forward. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. And hello to everybody.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you for being here.